In this video, I'm going to show you the exact moment your food choices start to break down your gut. And what often follows years or decades later is cardiovascular disease, dementia, cancer, stroke, type 2 diabetes, and premature aging. You see, these serious conditions are merely symptoms of a single underlying cause, a concealed lurking fire that might just be the most significant explanation for the vast majority of ill health and premature death in the Western world. What if I were to state that these underlying causes have virtually no genetic or environmental factors, and that this syndrome starts in childhood and without changing lifestyle habits will continue through life for years and decades until a health or life-limiting disease takes hold? And would you believe me if I said that a deep understanding of this ailment will act as the clearest evidence that you might have it, and therefore act as the best motivator to do something about it? Hello, my name is David Van Dyke, and in 1983 I graduated from a specialist college in England with a Bachelor of Science honours degree in sports science. In the intervening 43 years, where did that go? I've extended my skill set as a passion, a personal passion, and I've learnt so much that I thought it was time to bring that to social media, to bring that to YouTube. I've never done social media ever until now, and I want to do something that I don't think anyone else does or promises. I want to make all of you an expert in your own body. Today's video is about this single condition, systemic inflammation, and I'm going to do a deep dive into the exact moment this begins, how it continues, and therefore becomes chronic. I'm going to go down to the molecular level, always making it straightforward. As the deeper your understanding, the more likely you are to become an active participant in your own health journey, rather than just someone who watches videos on YouTube or looks at Instagram and everything that you see, you think, wow, that's great, but it's forgotten 5 minutes later. But what is systemic and chronic inflammation? They're terms you hear all the time, but never really get a full explanation of. Doctors, scientists, general public will talk of being inflamed and how it's very bad for you, but without any further details. Well, that changes right now. At the end of this video, you will understand exactly what's going on inside you, how it starts, how it continues, and how you are to blame. And that's the other thing with my videos. I'm not going to pussyfoot around. There'll be open and honest and frank discussion and very frank opinions from myself based on hard evidence. That's any good, that is, and there's an awful lot that isn't. So that's how this video is going to play out. So stay tuned, please. Euphemistically speaking, systemic inflammation is your body's alarm system being switched on, and chronic inflammation is when this switch gets stuck in this on position. Physiologically and simplistically speaking, this syndrome is due to your own white blood cells growing in such large numbers that they start to damage other cells and organs over years and decades. This damage can lead to those serious diseases that I set out in my opening sentence. There are many causes of inflammation in our bodies, but this video is going to be just about one of them, which is our diet. The other causes will be covered in my next video, but I'm doing a deep dive into diet as it's the strongest cause of this issue in most people. Plus it overlaps with other causes such as visceral fat, poor sleep, lack of exercise, so it deserves a special analysis. So please sit back and join me on this journey into how your food choices may end up shortening your health and your life. Before I go to the whiteboard, I do need to talk about cytokines. These are the very foundation of systemic and chronic inflammation, as they are the messaging proteins of our bloodstream. You see, white blood cells, macrophages, dendrites, B cells, T cells, and so on, don't really talk to one another. So imagine my body right now. I'm in good health as far as I'm aware, and my white blood cells that are in the billions in my body are lying dormant, but they are tracing around my bloodstream on patrol, so to speak. When we get a pathogen or antigen invasion due to a virus or bacterial infection, the white blood cells have to increase in number. It is cytokines, not the white blood cells, that dictate this increase. When a pathogen is detected, the white blood cells send out a message that is attached to a cytokine. This cytokine is released from the white blood cell itself. Think of it like this. The white blood cell, let's say a macrophage, notices it needs help, so it shouts out. From this cell, a cytokine is released that we can think of as a text message, and this message races around the bloodstream and quickly enters the bone marrow. Think of the bone marrow as a factory, and more macrophages are pumped out from these bone marrow cells into the bloodstream to help fight the invaders. So it is these cytokines that help regulate the number of white blood cells in our bloodstream at any one time. But they need a signal in order to increase in number. And if that signal is switched on, let's say due to a poor diet, then we are mimicking a constant infectious state in our bodies. So we're going to start with the gut. The gut runs from the mouth to the anus, but our interest is solely in this bit here, literally here, the small and the large intestine, which is the seat of chronic inflammation. But we need to start a little bit earlier than that, because there's an issue that often crops up when I'm asked about this subject, and it's the issue of the food that enters the stomach. Because food entering the stomach ends up being very acidic because of the acidic stomach juices, and stomach juices turn the food inside into chyme, a substance called chyme, which is a little bit like wallpaper paste, as it were, but it's highly acidic. How does that not damage and therefore cause systemic inflammation in the small intestine? It doesn't, because of the duodenum. The duodenum, as I've marked here, is this C-shaped part of intestine. It's the first part of intestine. It's the first part of absorption of the intestine. It absorbs water and iron and substances like that. But its most important job is to turn this chyme, marked in red here, as it passes through, into something neutral, as I've marked in green, so that when it enters the small intestine, it doesn't do any damage. And it does so by the addition of bicarbonate, which comes from Brunner's glands, which are contained within the duodenum. Now, the duodenum, that C-shaped thing, is only about 10 inches long. And in actual fact, its name, to give it its full Latin name, is Intestinum Duodenum Digitorum, which means 12 fingers in length, as it were. So the name duodenum, which means 12 fingers, has stuck, but it does that really important job. So food now entering the small intestine is neutral, does no damage in terms of its acidity, and it can be absorbed in the normal way, assuming, of course, you have a normal gut. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to take a deep dive into the small intestine, but most importantly into the large intestine, because within that area of gut contains the bulk of the microbiome, and the bacteria contained therein is mostly in the large intestine, and that is the major seat of chronic inflammation, as we'll learn. So now that I've talked about the duodenum and the terminology, let's do a deep dive into the small and large intestine and find that exact moment that the food choices we make start to break down the gut. So here we have the small intestine, and these are the microvilli, the very tip of the microvilli. Now, the small intestine is made up of folds. The folds are made up of villi, and the villi are made up of microvilli. If I tell you that there are up to 3,000 microvilli per villi, you will realise the surface area of the small intestine is vastly greater than what it actually occupies in the body. So much so that my little fingernail, if that were a piece of small intestine and it were folded out flat into its single-celled flatness, as it were, it would be the size of an A4 piece of paper. So the absorption surface area is substantially greater than it appears. Food will come along and food will be absorbed through the cell, and go into the bloodstream in the normal way that we understand. But food is also absorbed paracellularly through the gaps here. And these gaps are held together by protein bonds that I've represented with these anchor points in red. Now, there are several of these protein bonds, but for simplicity, I've just drawn the one. But make no mistake, they all do an important part. But they all need food. They need food like every cell in our body. And the food that they need is butyrate. And butyrate is a short-chain fatty acid that comes from the soluble fibre in our diet reacting with the bacteria of our microbiome, and they produce short-chain fatty acids. So if you like, the bacteria literally eat the soluble fibre, and the waste product, if you like, is short-chain fatty acid butyrate. And these anchor points feed off that butyrate. And that's true in the large intestine as well. They all need this food, and as a result, they become healthy and they keep the cells tightly packed together. These are called tight junctions. They're not immovable, but they are very tight. And they will only allow a certain number of substances through the paracellular route, because there's a concentration gradient between here and here. So as certain substances like water, chloride, sodium and that type of thing pass along, they don't necessarily go through here, although of course they do. But when there's a need for greater amounts of water, for example, they will also pass through the paracellular route, and they will do so because of a concentration gradient. It can't help itself effectively, it will go through there. Now, up here in these black buttons I have here, this represents the insoluble fibre, which we all know adds to our stool when we go to the toilet. And what happens with bacteria here in red is that the insoluble fibre will basically surround it, suck it up and move it further on until it passes into the large intestine and then out of the body. So that sort of takes care of a lot of the bacteria. And in the small intestine, things do move quite quickly, so the bacteria don't really have a lot of time to hang around. Some inflammation is caused by the small intestine, but it's not necessarily bacteria. The small intestine is the quickest growing cells in the body. They are epithelial cells, and in the small intestine they are the most rapidly growing, and they grow from underneath, and as they come up they push the now dying cells into the small intestine, to the extent that our stool minus water is about 5 to 15% weight of dead epithelial cells. So it's that important to us. But in the meantime, there are lots of epithelial cells dying and racing around. They're being taken out by the insoluble fibre, but there could be an issue with that. Once they get into the large intestine, this is where our story really starts to take off. The large intestine is also epithelial cells. Like the small intestine, it's single cell thickness. The food or the insoluble fibre comes into contact with just a single cell of epithelial cells in both the small and large intestine. So these tight junctions are super important to maintain, and in the large intestine they are maintained in the same way with this butyrate. So the food for the anchor points, of these protein anchor points, is still butyrate. But in the large intestine we also have these crypts that I've spelt out there, that contain mucus, and they go down 40 to 80 cells deep. So they're relatively speaking very deep. And a lot of chemical actions take place within the crypt, and to protect them from bacteria, because now we're in the large intestine and we've got a lot of bacteria racing through there. But most importantly, our microbiome, which contains trillions of cells of bacteria, most of them are in the large intestine. In fact, the figures I've seen are 90 to 99% are in the large intestine. Keep that in mind. So our bacteria are passing along. They can't get down these paracellular routes because they're too narrow, same as in here. And we've got epithelial cells and other insoluble fibre tracing through the large intestine and taking out the bacteria. The bacteria also can't get down into the cell or go through it because there's a mucus layer lining the inside of the large intestine that comes from the mucus producing molecules in the crypt. and the crypt fills up with mucus and it spreads out all along the large intestine. So the large intestine has a double protection, as it were. You've got the insoluble fibre capturing some of these bacteria, and also it can't reach the epithelial cell because of the thickness and the stickiness and the density of the mucus. So everything's great, but we have eaten food here that's now neutralized, and it contains soluble and insoluble fibre because we have eaten a good diet. We've eaten vegetables, we've eaten plants, and everything behaves normally, as I've just explained. If there's no fibre in that, or very little, or it's just insoluble fibre, we've got a real problem, because if it's just insoluble fibre, yep, we'll add to our stool, but it's the soluble fibre that is key to these protein bonds here. Without it, these protein bonds don't have food. They can't survive, and they start to break down. They start to dysfunction. And instead of being tight junctions, what you get is these junctions becoming either broken or stretchy, and the cells start to move apart. Now, this happens throughout the gut, but it doesn't happen to the whole gut, obviously, because if it did, you'd probably die. But it does happen in patches through the gut, and this is the exact moment that systemic inflammation starts. So this is the key to our video title. The food for the protein bonds doesn't exist if there's no soluble fibre. Remember the reaction between the bacteria and the soluble fibre? The bacteria eat it, and then the reaction is short chain fatty acid, butyrate, food. No soluble fibre, no food, and it starts to break down. And what happens then is that the epithelial cells that have died will start to come through the paracellular route, which is now widened, and into the bloodstream. And these epithelial cells shouldn't be there. They should be taken out through the colon and out into the world. They shouldn't be in the bloodstream. But because they are, they create a reaction from the white blood cells that need to come and deal with them, and that's the start of a little bit of systemic inflammation. But it's not terribly serious, because epithelial cells in the blood aren't terribly dangerous, as it were, but they will be dealt with in the normal way. The problem arises in the large intestine because two things happen. The first thing that happens is that in the same way that the cells break down, their protein bonds no longer hold tight, we have wider junctions occurring. So the cell has room to go down there, but we're still protected by the mucus barrier. That should still help us. But there's so much bacteria in the large intestine, and the bacteria now has no soluble fibre either, because in the same way in the small intestine, it requires soluble fibre for food. And without that food, because of the poor diet, then it turns to another food source. And that other food source is mucus. So it starts to eat away at our mucus layer, which is there to protect us from the bacteria. And without much of a mucus layer, or where the density reduces, the bacteria can now get through to the cell level. And of course, at the same time, we've got a double whammy. The cell gaps are now starting to dysfunction. So that bacteria can not only get through the cell, they can get down in between the cell, because they're sort of sucked down by the concentration gradient from here to here. So it's more dense up here, less dense down there, and it will follow down through the cell. So now, instead of just epithelial cells, we've now got bacteria passing down into the bloodstream in very high numbers, because there's so many bacteria within the large intestine. It's trillions of cells, and most 95% plus of the systemic inflammation you have is because of a breakdown of the tight junctions of our large intestine. And that is the exact moment that systemic inflammation occurs. And of course, chronic inflammation is merely systemic inflammation multiplied by time. So if you carry on with a bad diet where you've got very little fibre, then you're in big trouble. How do you get over it? Well, I'll explain in more detail in a later video. But very simply, if you just eat vegetables, normal vegetables, the great thing about nature is she has provided us with soluble and insoluble fibre in abundance in every vegetable there is. You don't have to worry which contains which, because they all contain both. So they give you a proper stool and they keep these protein bonds absolutely tight at all times. That's it, it's simple. In many ways, the diet is not about what you do eat, although if you eat packaged food, it's not really food, so you shouldn't be eating that. There are a whole host of other issues that create inflammation with that sort of food, which I'll explain in the next video. But if you have a diet that's very low on fibre, or it contains fibre but through a package, then you're in big trouble. There is a certain amount of fibre washing in the food industry now. What I mean by that is you'll see now packaged food contains X grams of fibre. In almost all cases, that fibre is insoluble fibre. So it helps with the bulk of the stool, which is fine, but it doesn't help feed our protein bonds, and they will break down and cause inflammation in the same way that I've just described. So we now have the situation where bacteria, pathogens and debris are coming through into the bloodstream in such vast numbers that a concomitant rise in white blood cells has to occur. If the breaking down of the tight junctions was the moment that began systemic inflammation, the stimulation of excess white blood cells, macrophages in particular, is the continuation of that systemic inflammation into chronic inflammation. If the habits that drive the breaking down of the gut continue, then chronic inflammation is the only result. And what is our time frame for all this to start? The gut microbiome can respond to a lack of soluble fibre within days, with reductions in beneficial fermentation products detectable in under a week. Researchers can often detect changes in stool metabolites, microbial diversity, and markers related to gut function, especially the levels of butyrate in a blood sample. But these measurements are not realistic for most of us. In almost all cases, the most obvious sign is experiencing symptoms such as constipation or altered bowel habits. More substantial effects on the intestinal mucus barrier and gut integrity are thought to develop over 4 to 8 weeks of sustained fibre deprivation. That means one thing. If you've been eating a diet of ultra-processed foods without much or any soluble fibre, and you've been doing this just for a month or two, your gut will now be dysfunctional and allowing bacteria and bacterial debris and pathogens into your bloodstream. And what if you've been doing this for years, which I'm guessing might be many of you watching? Then you've already had years of intestinal permeability, leaky gut, with all the long-term consequences of that. Now, in terms of the macrophages, there is also another problem which we have to address, and it's one that pretty much always comes with chronic inflammation, and that is insulin resistance. This has a bearing on the macrophages. Like all cells, macrophages need glucose or some sort of energy system in order to survive and function properly and efficiently. When you're in insulin resistance, as I think most of you probably know, the effectiveness of glucose on that particular cell is diminished substantially. Somewhere between 50 and 90% a diminished efficiency, which is massive. Now, if you imagine every white blood cell is diminished in the same way, because white blood cells get their glucose in the same way that all other cells get their glucose. When you are in insulin resistance, the white blood cell no longer recognizes glucose because of the resistance. It doesn't take much glucose into the cell and it starts to dysfunction. In order to function properly, it turns to another energy source, either glutamine, which is a protein, or a fatty acid. But they're both inefficient. They don't really work terribly well. Now, part of the issue with that means that all these pathogens that we've created in our diet and through our lack of fibre and maybe stress and obesity and smoking and alcohol and all these things, If the macrophages aren't working properly as well, not only do they have an enormous number of pathogens, extra pathogens that shouldn't be there to cope with, they can't cope with it very well either. So the macrophages, instead of being able to effectively remove these pathogens, can't effectively remove them. And if the pathogens are there, they've got to be removed. So the white blood cells send out messenger cytokines again to create more white blood cells, which in themselves will be dysfunctional because they too will be insulin resistant. So our white blood cells create a vicious circle, and it really is a vicious circle of white blood cells not functioning very well, creating more white blood cells as a result. You're introducing through your leaky gut more pathogens which need more white blood cells, which aren't working very well, which then carries on and on and on. So the white blood cells start to proliferate, they start to become so numerous that they have negative effects on the rest of the body. But for now, I hope you've understood right down to the cellular level, the moment your diet, your poor diet, and all the other things that I've mentioned begins the process of systemic inflammation. And if that continues over a period of time, and we are talking months, years and decades, then the effects on the body will be profound. And I'm going to say to you, last thing, please subscribe to this video, but only if you've learned something new. I want everyone on every one of my videos, and I'm hoping there'll be videos for many, many years to come, you learn something new every time. If I'm going to make you an expert in your own body, then it's going to be stuff that you've not heard before and stuff that you now understand. And if that's the case, please subscribe. Thank you very much. See you soon.